Adam here with the 16th weekly update of 2026, keeping you in the loop with what's happening across Greater Brisbane. And a quick heads up before we get into it, I've got the channel's first podcast launching later this week, where we go into a lot more detail on some of the big picture trends behind these stories. But for now, this week, there's been a pretty clear pattern emerging, because while Greater Brisbane continues to grow, and in many areas grow quite quickly, the systems that support that growth are being pushed harder than expected. Transport, housing, infrastructure, and cost of living. And in some cases, we're starting to see where those systems are holding up and where they're starting to struggle. This video is sponsored by Excel Psychology and YB Painting Services, but more on that later. Let's start with what's been one of the biggest disruptions this week across the city. If you've been catching public transport this week, particularly on the north side, there's a good chance you've felt this firsthand. Commuters have been dealing with long queues, major delays, and in some cases, journeys that would normally take 20 to 30 minutes blowing out to well over an hour. At Bowen Hills Station, queues for replacement buses stretched up to around 300 metres, wrapping down the street and around corners. At Northgate Station, commuters reported waiting 30 to 45 minutes just to board a bus, with some people taking 2 hours to get into the city. And this wasn't just a one-off moment, this was happening across multiple stations and multiple days. So what's actually going on? These disruptions were part of planned rail closures between Northgate and Bowen Hills, along with impacts to lines including Beenleigh, Gold Coast, Doomben, and the Sunshine Coast. The closures were scheduled to allow for maintenance and upgrade works, which are needed, but where things really started to break down was in the replacement system. Even though large numbers of buses were deployed, at one point around 260 buses on the south side and around 75 on the north side, there's a fundamental issue here. A train running every few minutes during peak hour can move thousands of people per hour. A bus, even one every 8 minutes, simply can't match that capacity. And that mismatch is what led to the queues, the delays, and the frustration. On top of that, demand was reportedly around 50% higher than expected, which suggests planning assumptions may not have fully matched real-world conditions. And that leads us to the political and operational debate. The government says industrial action by electrical workers over the Easter period extended the closures and made the situation worse. But critics, including transport advocates and many commuters, are pointing to inadequate bus numbers, poor communication, and the decision to shut multiple lines at once. There are also questions about whether closures should have been staggered instead of happening simultaneously. The Transport Minister has refused to apologise, saying the government worked to minimise disruption and that the situation was exacerbated by union actions. And this may not be the end of the disruption either. There are currently around 160 protected industrial action notices logged with the Fair Work Commission as 7 different unions negotiate new enterprise agreements with Queensland Rail. Unions are warning that this could lead to further disruption if agreements aren't reached. Some have pointed to what they describe as a more aggressive approach to negotiations, arguing that it risks prolonging the dispute. The government says it is negotiating in good faith and remains at the table. So while no additional mass closures have been scheduled in the immediate future, there is still a level of uncertainty hanging over the network. And depending on how the negotiations play out, this may not be the last time commuters experience disruptions like this. In terms of what happens next, there is some relief. North side services between Bowen Hills and Northgate are now returning, but for south side commuters, particularly those travelling from the Gold Coast and Logan areas, disruptions will continue. Rail buses are still running between Boggo Road and Varsity Lakes, with impacts expected through to the end of April and the network returning to normal from May the 1st. So while things are improving in some areas, this isn't over just yet. What all the recent disruptions show is just how many challenges the transport network faces as the city continues to grow. And actually, while we're talking about growth and how Greater Brisbane is handling it, that's something I go into in a lot more detail on the podcast that I mentioned earlier. I sat down with urban planner Dr. Tony Matthews, and we talked about what's driving growth across southeast Queensland, why housing affordability hasn't improved, and how all of this is actually planned for, or in some cases not planned for. So if you're interested in the bigger picture behind what we're seeing in these updates, keep an eye out for that podcast in the coming week. Now, while all of that's happening, we're also seeing pressure showing up in the cost of building across the region. New reporting this week suggests construction costs in southeast Queensland have risen by around $10,000 to $20,000 per home since late February. Builders say the increase is being driven largely by fuel prices, which have surged following conflict in the Middle East. Because fuel affects almost every stage of construction, from manufacturing to transport, those costs are flowing through the entire supply chain. Some materials have seen particularly sharp increases. PVC piping has reportedly gone up by around 60%, while electrical wiring is up around 40% in just a couple of months. And this is on top of existing pressure. Before this, construction costs were already rising at around 1% per month, partly due to strong demand from major infrastructure projects competing for labour and materials. Some builders say that rate could be closer to 1.5% to 2% per month. Industry groups are warning that builders working on fixed price contracts are especially exposed. Because if costs keep rising after a contract is signed, those increases can't always be passed on. And that raises the risk of financial stress or even insolvencies, similar to what we saw during COVID. There are also broader implications here. Higher construction costs can push up the cost of new housing, slow down the delivery of new homes, and potentially delay infrastructure projects. And as one builder put it, even if demand for housing is strong, that doesn't matter if people can't actually afford to build. That ties into separate data out this week showing the number of Queensland households on hardship plans for energy bills has doubled over the past year, from around 18,500 to more than 37,000. The government says power prices could fall by around 10% next year, saving roughly $1,035 per household on average. But the broader picture right now is that many households are still under pressure. And again, this fits into the pattern we're seeing this week. It's not just one issue so much as multiple pressures hitting all at once. While construction costs have been rising, as a viewer of the Brisbane channel, painting services can be something you save money on, thanks to the sponsor of this video, YB Painting. They recently picked up 2 first and 3 second place awards at the Master Painters Australia Queensland Awards for 2025, which gives you an idea of the standard they're working at. They offer fixed pricing and a 5-year warranty on their work, so you know exactly what you're getting up front. You can claim an exclusive 10% discount by scanning the QR code on screen or through the link in the video description. And while we're on housing and development, there's also been an example this week of how misinformation can spread around these issues. There's been a claim circulating on social media that a fertiliser plant in Brisbane is being demolished to make way for housing for migrants. But according to AAP Fact Check, that claim is false. The site in question is the former fertiliser plant on Gibson Island, which was closed back in 2023 and later purchased by industrial developer Goodman Group. The land is zoned for special industry, which is reserved for high-impact industrial uses. There has been no development application lodged with Brisbane City Council, and the owner has said there are no plans to change the site's industrial use. So while housing and population growth are real pressures, this is a good example of how not every claim circulating online reflects what's actually happening on the ground. Now, while all of that's happening, we're also seeing some smaller but quite telling responses to supply and cost pressures at a local level. In the Redlands, Council has added real-time fuel pricing and availability to its disaster dashboard. This allows residents to see which service stations have fuel, how much it costs, and how supply is changing across the region, including on the mainland and North Stradbroke Island. It's been added to the same dashboard used during major emergencies and natural disasters. Council says the goal is to help residents make informed decisions about when and where they can purchase fuel, particularly as conditions change. The system shows each service station on a map with indicators for availability, partial supply, or unknown status, so people can quickly assess the situation before heading out. The key point here is that access to fuel is being treated not only as essential to keeping the city running, but also part of broader disaster response infrastructure. So again, it's a relatively small change on the surface, but it does reflect a broader shift in how supply, cost, and resilience are being managed. Another area where that pressure is showing up is in transport policy. As I've already covered in recent videos, the state government is looking at tightening rules around e-bikes and e-scooters. One of the most controversial elements is a proposed speed limit of 10 km per hour on shared paths. Supporters say the changes are aimed at improving safety, particularly after a rise in injuries linked to e-mobility devices. But there has been significant criticism from a range of groups, including councils, transport organisations, and cycling advocates. One of the key concerns is that the proposed laws don't clearly distinguish between legal pedal-assisted e-bikes and illegal high-powered e-motorbikes. Under the current Australian rules, a legal e-bike is essentially a bicycle with pedal assistance, limited to 250 watts and cutting out at 25 km per hour. And for now, they don't require registration for a license. Critics argue that many of the serious safety issues are linked to illegal throttle-controlled devices that can reach much higher speeds rather than standard pedal-assisted bikes. Another major concern is the proposed 10 km per hour speed limit. Some riders say that maintaining that speed on a bicycle is actually difficult and can be unstable, particularly when trying to balance at very low speeds. There are also warnings that slowing riders down on shared paths could have unintended consequences. If e-bike users are no longer able to travel efficiently on those paths, they may be pushed onto the road network instead. And in many parts of Greater Brisbane, there isn't a continuous network of protected bike lanes, which raises safety concerns about mixing with traffic. That links to another key point raised in submissions to the inquiry. A significant proportion of serious incidents involving cyclists and e-mobility users involve interactions with motor vehicles, rather than just riders on paths. So some groups are arguing that focusing too heavily on restricting riders rather than improving infrastructure and separation from cars may not address the root cause of many injuries. There are also broader concerns about how these changes affect everyday transport. E-bikes have seen increased uptake in recent years, particularly as fuel prices have risen, because they offer a relatively low-cost way to commute. Some users say the proposed laws could make commuting slower, less practical, and in some cases not viable at all, with estimates that travel times could roughly double under the new speed limits. Organisations like Bicycle Queensland have argued that overly restrictive rules risk discouraging people from using active transport altogether, particularly at a time when governments are trying to reduce congestion and emissions. RACQ and several councils have also raised concerns about the licensing and speed proposals, questioning whether they are proportionate or practical in a city that is still building out its cycling infrastructure. At the same time, there is still support for stronger enforcement around illegal high-powered devices, which are widely seen as a genuine safety risk. Bicycle Queensland says that in the last year, at least 5 children lost their lives in incidents involving these vehicles. So again, this comes back to the challenges in finding ways to keep people safe while ensuring people have practical transport options that aren't stifled by overly aggressive regulation, particularly at a time when more people are turning to those options because of cost of living pressures. And if you're experiencing this kind of stress or need support with things like anxiety, depression, managing ADHD, or relationship challenges, the other sponsor of this video, Excel Psychology, may be worth a look. They're a warm and inclusive psychology practice based in Spring Hill, just a short walk from Central Station. They've got a diverse team of clinical and registered psychologists, and they focus on matching you with the right person for your needs, often with a relatively short wait time. They also offer Medicare rebates with a mental health treatment plan and support work cover and NDIS participants. If you'd like to find out more, you can scan the QR code on screen or check out the link in the description. Now, the next story is a bit different. Researchers have uncovered evidence of a major ancient earthquake on a fault line west of Caboolture. It's estimated to have been a magnitude 6.5 or higher and occurred somewhere between 20,000 and 35,000 years ago. Council says information from the study will help inform long-term disaster planning.
It will provide a holistic view for all agencies in the event of an earthquake in the city of Moreton Bay.
You may be surprised that earthquakes are considered to be Queensland's 9th natural hazard risk priority, meaning they're relatively low risk but still part of the state's long-term disaster planning. The next update is something that will potentially affect people across all of Greater Brisbane's LGAs. The state government is considering tougher bail laws, including mandatory sentencing for repeat breaches. Details are still being worked through, but I'll keep you updated here on the Brisbane channel as details emerge, so make sure you're subscribed and have hit the bell so you get notifications. In the last update, we talked about early intervention programs intended to reduce youth crime before it happens, stalling due to procurement challenges. But despite these issues, the government says it now has rolled out 50 early intervention programs across the state, with the latest being the Top Blokes Mentoring Program, which will work with schools in Brisbane and the Gold Coast to support at-risk boys aged 10 to 17 to reconnect with education, training, or a job. Focusing specifically on the Brisbane LGA, and there are some interesting signals about how the city itself is changing. An 18-storey office tower at 150 Charlotte Street has sold for around $40 million. Back in 2017, the same building sold for over $105 million. At the time, it was fully occupied with tenants including Boeing Defence Australia and the federal government. But now it's largely vacant and requires significant upgrades, leading to a drop in value of more than 60% over less than a decade. This reflects a broader shift we're seeing in the office market, where older buildings are struggling while newer premium developments continue to attract investment. At Rocklea, work has now begun on upgrades to the Curzon Street Bridge, which is the main access point into the Brisbane markets. The bridge will be raised by around 1.2 metres, along with a full road reconstruction and supporting upgrades. The Brisbane markets have been operating for more than 60 years and play a key role in food supply across Queensland. So this project is about ensuring access can be maintained even during major flood events. And at Kangaroo Point, James Warner Park and CT White Park are set to partially close for remediation works. Testing has found elevated levels of heavy metals in the soil, including copper, nickel, and zinc. Council says this dates back to historic industrial uses of the land. The works will involve removing contaminated soil, replanting vegetation, and upgrading facilities, with some areas to be closed for several months. If you find these updates helpful, you can say thanks by buying me a coffee or becoming a channel member, which helps me keep running the channel, putting in the work, and keeping you in the loop. Being part of the community that supports the channel also gets you access to extra content, which is my way of saying thanks for the support. But of course, giving the video a like is free and also helps the channel. In Logan, the Mount Lindesay Highway upgrade at Jimboomba is now complete. A 1.5 kilometre section has been widened from 2 lanes to 4, improving traffic flow for around 25,000 vehicles per day. The project also includes upgraded intersections, a new bridge, and improved pedestrian infrastructure. Now to Ipswich, which continues to be the fastest growing city in Queensland, with population growth of around 3.5% over the past year. Much of that growth is concentrated in Springfield and Ripley, with Ripley growing by more than 15%. The city's population is projected to reach around 500,000 by 2046. Population increase is something we discuss in the channel's first podcast, so again a reminder for you to keep your eye out for that this coming week. At the same time in Ipswich, environmental restoration work at Bundamba Creek has seen tens of thousands of plants planted and significant stabilisation of creek banks. In Moreton Bay, suburbs like Caboolture, Morayfield and Burpengary are among the most active housing markets in the state. Growth is putting pressure on infrastructure, prompting calls to bring forward major projects like the Bruce Highway Western Alternative, as I mentioned in last week's video. Planning is also shifting towards higher density development in key areas while maintaining large non-urban areas. And while we're talking about Moreton Bay, I have to share a quick update on Infinity Planet. You may remember I did a dedicated video on the ambitious proposed development a few months back. There are reports that an engineering firm involved in the project is still owed more than $145,000 for required work. Without that, the project can't progress through approvals unless another consultant is brought in. So the question now is less about the concept and more about whether the project can actually move forward at all. In the Redlands, Council has adopted a new active transport strategy aimed at increasing walking and cycling to around 18% of all trips by 2046. The focus is on making it easier to move between homes, schools and centres without relying on cars, particularly as the population grows. And while we're in the Redlands, let's get to the proposed Redland Whitewater Centre, which some viewers have been asking about. The plans have now been referred to the federal government for environmental assessment. This means that it will be reviewed under national environmental laws to determine its potential impact before it can proceed. That's an important step because there have already been a range of environmental concerns raised about the project. Some submissions and reports have pointed to potential impacts on koala habitat and other native wildlife, as well as the broader ecological value of the Birkdale site. There have also been concerns about the potential impact on groundwater-dependent ecosystems, particularly given the scale of construction and the amount of water required to operate a whitewater facility. Whitewater venues typically require large volumes of water to be pumped, circulated, and managed, and some critics argue that this could place additional pressure on local water systems over time. At the same time, the project has been designed to sit within a much larger precinct. The broader Birkdale Community Precinct covers around 62 hectares, with about 36 hectares set aside as conservation area, and the Whitewater Centre itself occupying a relatively small portion of the total site. Supporters of the project say this allows for a balance between development and environmental protection and point to potential long-term uses, including recreation, tourism, and emergency services training. This federal environmental referral is effectively the next major checkpoint, and depending on the outcome, the project could proceed as planned, require changes, or face delays. So while the Whitewater Centre has been positioned as part of the long-term Olympic legacy, this step highlights that there are still a number of approvals and considerations to work through before it becomes a reality. At the same time, the shortlist for consortia to deliver the new stadium at Victoria Park has been narrowed down to 2. Both will now test how the project can be delivered efficiently and within budget, and the stadium is expected to hold around 60,000 people during the games before expanding to around 63,000 in legacy mode. Brisbane City has also signed a partnership with Los Angeles, the host of the 2028 Olympics, to share knowledge and preparation strategies with Brisbane's first new sister city agreement in 16 years. Brisbane's other sister cities are Kobe, Auckland, Shenzhen, Semarang, Kaohsiung, Daejeon, Chongqing, Abu Dhabi, and Hyderabad. Taking everything we've seen this week into account, we can see that the region is growing quickly. That growth, combined with external factors such as events playing out globally, is putting pressure on transport, housing, infrastructure, and cost of living. And while responses are happening, they're not always keeping pace. Some areas are catching up, others are still struggling, and that's something we'll keep tracking as things continue to evolve. Before we wrap up, it's time for me to give my 2 cents. And just quickly for anyone new here, this is the part of the video where I step away from just reporting what's happening and I share a bit of my own perspective. This week, I want to talk about something that sits underneath a lot of these stories. And that's this idea that at the moment, it feels like it's becoming harder to live cheaply. And it's not just about one thing. It's not just about fuel prices or rent or groceries. It's the combination of everything. We're seeing construction costs rise, which flows into housing. We're seeing pressure on transport systems, which affects how people get to work. And at the same time, we're seeing proposals that could change how people use lower cost transport options like e-bikes. And none of these things are happening in isolation. They're all stacking on top of each other. Now, just to be clear, I don't think anyone is intentionally trying to make life more expensive. Most of these decisions are being made with good intentions, improving safety, managing growth, upgrading infrastructure. All of that makes sense. But I do think there's a risk that when you look at these things individually, they can seem reasonable. But when you experience them all at once, the effect can feel quite different. Because from the perspective of someone just trying to get through the week, what it can feel like is that the cheaper, more flexible options are slowly being squeezed. Whether that's the cost of building, the cost of transport, or the practicality of alternatives. And that's where I think it starts to connect to something else we touched on earlier, the way that people interpret what's happening. Because when people feel that pressure and they see rapid change happening around them, it creates uncertainty. And that uncertainty can make it easier for misinformation to take hold. Not necessarily because people are trying to mislead others, but because the explanations people are hearing feel like they fit what we're experiencing. And I think that's something worth being aware of, because it means that addressing misinformation isn't just about correcting facts. It's also about understanding why certain ideas resonate in the first place. It's understandable why not only is there a lot of misinformation and disinformation out there, but also why it's spreading so easily. Often it's that people are struggling or dissatisfied and they're looking for information that explains that or gives someone to blame, whether that's certain politicians, youth, boomers, immigrants, whatever. I'm not saying that nobody is to blame for many of the challenges and struggles we currently face, but I am saying that we need to be very careful to not only check the accuracy of the information we listen to before we make those calls, but also that we actively search for alternative points of view and information that may challenge what seems to us to just be common sense. Because I can say for myself that there have been times when I've discovered that something that I just assumed was common sense turned out to be wrong. That's my thoughts. Anyway, I mentioned Infinity Planet in this update, so here's the video explaining what that's all about. And here's last week's update, which it seems many of you missed. See you there.